Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett was on Greenlight with Chris Long, the podcast. I don't know if this was yesterday or a couple days ago. Good show, by the way. Chris Long, very, very intelligent, accomplished, and insightful, entertaining person. I enjoy the Greenlight with Chris Long podcast. Whenever I see the clips, I always watch them because the conversations that he has with people are very good, genuine conversations. I think I'm excited for Kyle Long also to get involved in me or whatever he ends up doing. I think he's trying to take on golf right now. I think that guy was almost a professional baseball player before he decided to just go play offensive line in the NFL. Like, I think that was exactly what Kyle did. He said, Kyle said, I'm going to get away from baseball. I'm just going to go be an offensive lineman in the NFL. Starts making the Pro Bowls and everything of that nature. Now he's retired, going about his life. But on Greenlight with Chris Long, the podcast, Michael Bennett was on the show and Devin McCourty. They were having a conversation, and I believe the conversation was about police brutality and social injustice. And the conversation was going in a very, a meaningful convo there. And I think Chris Long is using his platform in a beautiful fashion to have those conversations that we've had in locker rooms and hopefully maybe open some people's eyes about things that are happening that maybe you don't know about if you don't live in the neighborhood and things of that nature. And Michael Bennett came out of left field, bang, in the middle of this conversation and said something that we are now talking about when it doesn't come to police brutality or anything. When we're talking strictly football talk, this is something that has to be addressed. Michael Bennett, in the middle of this conversation, do we have the... Yep. All right, do we have the thing? Yes, so I want to read the entire conversation just so you know that Michael Bennett had this on his heart. Michael Bennett had this on his mind. He had this on the tip of his tongue. Chris Long is saying, look, I look at the Carson Wentz situation. Someone I always knew had it in him if you play with Carson. He's a good guy, but you don't know if he has the intestinal fortitude to be that first one to step over the line. And I think that was about equality and things of that nature. Michael Bennett cuts him off and goes, Nick Foles is better. Just in the middle. Look, dash. I haven't heard this clip in its entirety. I've just seen the quotes written out. Dash. He was not finished with that sentence. And Michael Bennett's like, well, now that we have you here, Nick Foles is better. Long goes, oh, he said Nick Foles is better. Devin McCourty laughs. Bennett goes, keep going with your statement, whatever you're going to say. Keep going. As a sidebar, it seems to matter what time you were on, too, because it didn't go well in Jacksonville with Nick Foles. Yeah. I'm just saying, Bennett goes, and Bennett's basically like, get back to what you were talking about. I just wanted to get this out there that Nick Foles is better than Carson Wentz. And then goes, you're the worst. You're trying to have a serious conversation and you want to divide Philly in half. I love both those mother effers. Let me both sides that. There's no both sidesing on police brutality to me, but on the Nick Foles, Carson Wentz, by the way, good hosting there, by the way. Yeah. Good hosting there, by the way, doing that whole thing. I'm going to straddle the line like a effing champ. Bennett played with Foles and Wentz during 2018 season before he signed with the Cowboys, and he went 4-1 with Nick Foles as a starter. This was not the Super Bowl year. This was the year after the Super Bowl year where Nick Foles had to start some games. He won 4-1. Michael Bennett was on that team before he got shipped down to Dallas to play down there. And there's always been the thought of, in my eyes, they picked Carson Wentz, the man they drafted in the first round, over the guy that won them a Super Bowl whenever the person that they picked in the first round got hurt after going on an MVP campaign. Carson Wentz was on an MVP-like campaign. He was on a rocket ship. Sorry about that, Don in Westwood One. Rocket ship up to the top of class of quarterback conversation. He really was with that Philadelphia Eagles team. He gets hurt in LA or whatever. Nick Foles comes in, and all of a sudden, Nick Foles becomes this super quarterback. The perfect player for the team that they were. They were this underdog team. Nick Foles was this underdog quarterback. He got casted off, basically, went out into the woods with his brother-in-law. He was thinking about retiring, decides to come back, goes back to Philadelphia after getting kicked out of Philadelphia because of Chip Kelly years, and he's his backup quarterback, and he goes and wins the Super Bowl and has the gumption in the Super Bowl to say, hey, how about Philly, by the way? Makes a call to the head coach in one of the biggest situations of the biggest game that he will ever play. Now there's a statue up because of it. There's an entire situation. Nick Foles is his hero. Carson Wentz's MVP season has basically been forgotten about because Big Richard Nick Foles has come in. There's people eating horse poop on the streets during parades. They're knocking down things. There's all this celebration in Philadelphia for the first time in 50 years. A Super Bowl is won there. next season. Well, who's going to be the guy? Is it going to be Carson Wentz or is it going to be Nick Foles? Nick Foles won you a Super Bowl, called to play in the Super Bowl to win you the game, basically. They had a statue of the damn guy. Who's going to be your starter? They come out and say, Carson Wentz is our starter, but he's not cleared yet, so Nick Foles will start. Nick Foles comes out, wins the game early, does the whole thing. Carson Wentz gets back in. This is coming off an entire, year almost of being off. So no rust. No rust has been shook off from Carson Wentz in a game. That's when Michael Bennett's there. He ends up getting hurt again. He sits out a game. Nick Foles comes back in, wins again in Chicago for the double doink game whenever the ball was blocked and nobody talked about that. Then he goes down to New Orleans and they had a touchdown to win that playoff game. They would have been back in the NFC Championship game with Nick Foles at quarterback, but instead ball was dropped. Saints end up winning or whatever, and they send Nick Foles to Jacksonville.
Jeez.
They could have re-signed him. They chose not to re-sign him. They go to Nick Foles. So now the entire conversation is, so they picked Carson Wentz over Nick Foles. That's what they did. So Carson Wentz now has to carry all this weight on his shoulder. Like, okay, the guy that I helped get to the Super Bowl, by the way, I put them in a position to be there. Now, would Nick Foles have been able to do that his entire season with Philadelphia? Maybe, we don't know. But Carson Wentz knows that the conversation is, you haven't won a Super Bowl. Nick Foles has won a Super Bowl, even though you have a Super Bowl ring. And I would assume Carson Wentz and Nick Foles are good friends, but that chatter has to leak into Carson Wentz's ears at some point. So now he's playing, and the conversation, if they don't win a Super Bowl or go to the playoff, last year their entire team got hurt. Carson Wentz was doing everything he possibly could, but they didn't make it as far as they did with Nick Foles, a quarterback. So the conversation is, was this the right decision? Was this the right decision? Now you got Michael Bennett coming out and being like, hey, for what it's worth, I was there. Nick Foles is better. Nick Foles gets $175 million from Jacksonville. He gets hurt throwing a touchdown for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Gardner Minshew comes in. They trade him out of town to Chicago. Now, could this thing come full circle? The Eagles with Nick Foles are the ones that double doinked and blocked the kick that sent the Bears home, and it put him in an interesting spiral down. Now, is he going to be the starting quarterback? Because I do believe, if you look at his history of what he has played and how he has played in his last, let's say 15 games, Nick Foles is an absolute superstar, and Michael Bennett believes that's the case as well.
Yeah, I think the issue with Carson now in his career, like the year of the Super Bowl, the year after where Foles had to play, last year where McCown had to come in the playoff game and play with a torn hamstring, like he just hasn't been able to stay healthy for a full year to prove like that he can play. Like, because the year that he got hurt and they won the Super Bowl, he was in the MVP conversation before he got hurt. So he just needs to put together a full season to show everyone that that's what he can do.
He's going to have to win a Super Bowl. Carson Wentz is going to have to do, he got paid over $100 million. They sent Nick Foles out of town, so there was no more conversation about who's the starter, who's not, whose locker room is this. He's going to have to win a Super Bowl, and that is a very difficult task. There's not a lot of quarterbacks that win Super Bowls, especially when Tom Brady's playing and Patrick Mahomes playing in the same time. That's going to be difficult, but that's what everybody's going to expect, and until that happens, this conversation is going to continue, especially when old teammates are like, yep, Nick Foles, by the way. He's better than that guy who was in the MVP conversation twice now. Nick Foles is the guy. That's why he's a Super Bowl MVP. That's why there's a statue for him. That's why Jacksonville paid him what he is. Now Jacksonville's trying to tank, get him out of town and send him up to Chicago. But maybe the Chicago Bears sign Ted Ginn. They bring in Nick Foles. Maybe Nagy's up there trying to cook up something a little bit special after last year's disappointing season for everybody in the Midland.
With Carson Wentz, too, it seems like they're stripping away a lot of like the potential excuses people would use for him for next year. Like they brought in all these guys on offense so they don't have, like CFL level players that he's throwing to. Like they're shoring up the defense. It seems like this year is kind of like his defining year.
And if he gets hurt again, which he has gotten hurt, and it's not, I don't think it's fair to say that people are injury prone. Especially older players, like, well, he's injury prone. Well, sometimes things happen that are out of your control. But Carson Wentz has been injury prone. I mean, that is just something that is the case. So the Jalen Hurts drafting makes sense because you don't have McCown there anymore. You don't have Foles there. You're going to need a viable backup because if history has shown us anything, it's that Carson Wentz is going to miss a few games. And those games, by the way, when Nick Foles were there, were won. And that is why this conversation even is happening.